They threw Daniel into a den of starving lions, expecting to hear him scream. Instead, there was silence. What happened in that pit that night is the secret every believer needs when they feel like they're being thrown to the lions too. Stay with us, because the reason those lions never touched him is buried in a single verse almost nobody quotes in full. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that silence happened. Let's start with who Daniel was at this point in his life. He wasn't a young man anymore. By the time we reach Daniel chapter 6, he'd already survived the Babylonian exile as a teenager, interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, watched an empire fall, and read handwriting off a wall for Belshazzar the night Babylon itself collapsed. Decades had passed. Now he was serving under a ruler the book calls Darius the Mede, and Daniel 6:3 tells us he distinguished himself above all the other administrators and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. The king was actually planning to set him over the entire kingdom. Before we go further, it's worth being honest about something scholars still debate. Darius the Mede isn't clearly attested outside the Bible under that exact name at that exact moment in history. Some historians propose he's a throne name used by Cyrus the Great himself. Others point to a Median governor named Gubaru, appointed by Cyrus to administer Babylon, as a likely candidate. It's a genuine historical puzzle, not something skeptics invented to attack the story, and it's honest to say it isn't fully settled. What we can say with confidence is that the political situation described, a Median or Persian ruler governing a newly absorbed Babylon through a structure of satraps, matches the actual transition of power in that region remarkably well. Now, back to Daniel's problem, which had nothing to do with his competence and everything to do with his success. The other officials couldn't stand watching an exile rise above them. Daniel 6:4 says they sought to find a ground for complaint against him, but they could find no error or fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Think about what that actually means. Decades in public service, across multiple kings and at least one regime change, and his enemies combed his entire record and came up with nothing. So they switched targets. They said to each other, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Daniel 6:5. If they couldn't catch him doing wrong, they'd make his obedience to God the crime itself. So roughly 120 satraps and administrators approached King Darius together, flattering him into signing a decree. For 30 days, no one could petition any god or man except the king, on penalty of being thrown into a den of lions. And here's a detail that matters more than most people realize. Persian and Median law had a genuinely strange feature, confirmed in other ancient sources beyond the Bible as well. Once a king signed a decree, not even the king himself could revoke it. Daniel 6:8 and 12 both stress this point deliberately. Darius wasn't just being cruel later in this story. He was walking into a trap sealed by his own signature, and the men who set it knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel knew exactly what had been signed too, and Daniel 6:10 tells us what he did next. He went to his house, where he had windows open toward Jerusalem in his upper chamber, and got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Notice that last phrase, as he had done previously. Daniel didn't stage some new act of defiance to make a point. He simply refused to stop an old one. That detail about windows facing Jerusalem isn't incidental either. It echoes Solomon's own prayer at the temple's dedication, generations earlier, asking that if God's people were ever exiled and prayed toward this city and this house, God would hear them from heaven. 1 Kings 8:44 through 48. Daniel was living out a promise made long before he was born, in the exact posture it was written for. His enemies were watching for precisely this. They reported him immediately, and Darius, we're told in Daniel 6:14, was greatly distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, laboring until sundown, trying to find a way out. He couldn't find one. The law he'd signed was now sealed against the one man he most wanted to save. So Daniel was brought to the den, and Darius said something remarkable to him before the stone was ever rolled into place. "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Daniel 6:16. A pagan king, cornered by his own law, still hoping out loud that Daniel's God was real. The stone was sealed with the king's own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed concerning Daniel. Daniel 6:17. That night, Darius couldn't eat. Daniel 6:18 says no diversions were brought before him, and sleep fled from him. Picture that contrast for a moment. In the palace, the most powerful man in the region lies awake in the dark, pacing, refusing food, haunted by a decision he can't undo. In the den, surrounded by animals that had clearly been kept hungry for exactly this purpose, Daniel was, as far as the text shows us, at peace. One man had all the power and none of the rest. The other had no power at all, and somehow rest. At the first light of dawn, Darius ran to the den and cried out in anguish, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel 6:20. And then comes the verse almost nobody quotes in full, the one carrying the actual answer. Daniel 6:22. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O King. I have done no harm." Read that final clause again. Because I was found blameless before him. This wasn't simply an act of raw protective power, like a shield thrown up around a man in sudden danger. The text frames it as a verdict. Daniel wasn't just rescued, he was acquitted. The den that was built to execute a guilty man instead became the place where his innocence was formally declared, sealed by the very stone meant to seal his death. It's worth noting Psalm 91 makes a similar promise centuries before this event, that God would give his angels charge over the faithful, and that they would tread upon the lion and the serpent. Whether or not Daniel had that exact psalm in mind that night, the pattern is the same one Scripture keeps returning to. Hebrews 11:33 later summarizes this kind of faith directly, describing those who through faith stopped the mouths of lions, placing Daniel's ordeal on the same honor roll as every other believer who trusted God against impossible odds. And here's the detail that proves this wasn't simply a den of unusually calm lions. Daniel 6:24 tells us that once Daniel was pulled out unharmed, the men who had conspired against him were thrown into that same den instead, along with their wives and children. And before they even reached the bottom of the pit, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. I want to be honest about how uncomfortable that detail is. Punishing entire families for one man's crime feels brutal to us today, and it was brutal. But it reflects a real and well-documented practice in ancient Persian and Median law, where treason against the king could be punished across an entire household, not just the individual accused. The text isn't endorsing that practice as good. It's simply reporting what these men's own trap did to them, using their own law in their own den. The lions were not tame animals who happened to like Daniel. They were exactly as hungry and dangerous as advertised, proven within seconds on the very next people thrown in. Which means what happened to Daniel wasn't the absence of danger, it was danger completely and specifically overruled. Darius's response afterward tells you everything about how deeply this shook him. Daniel 6:26 and 27 record an actual royal decree sent to every people, nation, and language in his entire kingdom, commanding that everyone should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, because he is the living God, enduring forever, whose kingdom shall never be destroyed, and whose dominion shall be to the end. This is a pagan king, ruling one of the most powerful empires on earth, putting his own name and authority behind a theological statement about a foreign god's eternal reign. That's not a small gesture. That's a king publicly rewriting his understanding of ultimate power after watching it play out in a stone pit overnight. So here's what this story is actually offering you. Daniel didn't survive that den because he was fearless or lucky, or because the lions happened to be full that particular night. He survived because he had spent decades building a life with nothing to hide, praying the same prayer with the windows open long before anyone was watching to punish him for it. When the pit finally came, the verdict was already written into how he had lived every ordinary day leading up to it. If you feel like you're being thrown to your own lions right now, unfairly, through no fault of your own, because someone couldn't find anything wrong with your work, so they came after your faith instead, this story isn't telling you the danger is fake. The lions in your life are as real and hungry as the ones in that den. It's telling you that the same God who shut those mouths still writes verdicts, not just rescues, and that the quiet, unremarkable faithfulness nobody's watching is exactly what the verdict gets written on. If this story gave you something to hold on to, leave the like and subscribe, because there's another impossible night in Scripture we haven't told you about yet.